Hey folks, today I am not just going to be sharing one of my favorite books with you, but actually I'm going to focus on my absolute all-time favorite author ever, Agatha Christie. I have no idea when I first started reading Agatha Christie's books, so I guess I'll just talk about some of my favorites and what makes her different from so many of the other great writers. The first book that she ever published was The Mysterious Mr Styles, which also features her most famous detective, Hercule Poirot. That's one of the most famous Poirot books, along with The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which is really good. Don't have that personally. But also Murder on the Orient Express, which recently came out as another movie. And then, of course, there's my favorite Poirot book, which is 13 at Dinner, or also Lord Edgware Dies. You can tell this one is like very, very, very well loved. It's held together with tape and just, it's so good because this presents a great transition into one of her other detectives, Miss Marple, who was first introduced in, actually, I think that was the first book of hers that I read, Murder at the, help me out, I've only ever seen it written. Is it Vicarage or Vicarage? Not really sure. Anyway, one of her side characters is possibly one of my favorite of her archetypes. It is the actress Jane Hillier, who is a bubble-headed blonde, but not quite as much of one as one might think. So in Strange Jest, it starts out, "And this," said Jane Hillier, completing her introductions, "is Miss Marple." Being an actress, she was able to make the point. It was clearly the climax, the triumphant finale. Her tone was equally compounded of reverent awe and triumph. The odd part of it was that the object thus profoundly proclaimed was merely a gentle, fussy-looking elderly spinster. In the eyes of the two young people who had just by Jane's good offices made her acquaintance, there showed incredulity and a tinge of dismay. We meet Jane earlier in one of the first collections. Murder at the Vicarage came out in 1930, and 13 Problems came out a little bit later in 1932. And this was when it's an overarching story where a bunch of friends get together and they're all going to share stories about crimes that have gone unsolved. And they're going to try to figure out who really did what. And to the reader's not surprise, Miss Marple, of course, is just brilliant. She solves everything. But Jane's story is a little bit different because what they'll do is they'll tell the story, they'll all give their guesses, and then the person telling the story reveals it. Jane's story ends with her stumping everybody, including Miss Marple. And then they say, "Okay, Jane, so what really happened?" And she says, "What? What do you mean?" They said, "Well, tell us the answer. We're stumped. We give up." And she says, "Oh, but I don't know." They're like, "Wait, what?" And she says, "Well, I wanted to know the answer, and that's why I told you. I thought all of you were so very clever that you'd be able to tell me." And they're all ticked. They're thinking, "Jane, you're really pretty, but that's only going to get you so far. This goes beyond that." And just the interactions of the characters is what absolutely makes it. So that one's probably off on a bookshelf somewhere, and I was irresponsible and did not put it back with the others, which is why I couldn't put my hands on it for this video. So that brings me to one of Miss Marple's other set of recurring characters, which is Tommy and Tubbins. And they are somewhat unique in that they're also amateur detectives. But unlike Poirot and Miss Marple, they age much more consistently. Poirot does age a little bit, especially towards the end of his career and Christie's writing career, but it's not steady throughout. He's just sort of grown up, sort of past his career as a Belgian police detective. And he's a refugee in Britain. And Miss Marple, on the other hand, is an elderly spinster. And as the stories progress, she actually seems to get a little bit more active. And the ages given by other characters talking about her doesn't seem to be consistent. But Tommy and Tuppence age throughout their series, and there aren't as many books about them. They're also a little bit more of an adventure story, and Christie's adventure stories and romances are often overlooked, but I find them absolutely delightful. They're very pulpy, they're lots of fun, and very much like her mysteries. They're technically they're whodunits, but they're much more about the character archetypes and what she uses to show about human nature and society through those archetypes. And it's just so much fun. So one of my favorites is Partners in Crime. I actually do not have the earliest one, which is The Secret Adversary, which I've had several copies of, but either I read them so much that they fall apart, or I loan them out and I don't get them back, so I don't have that one right now. Partners in Crime is like the 13 Problems in that there's an overarching story framework. Having it actually be a story is a little bit of a stretch. Tommy and Tuppence set up a detective agency, and they decide that each time they take a case, they are going to see what sort of literary detective author it best seems to match. And they're going to approach that case as though they were the fictional detectives in that author's stories. And it contains just brilliant dialogue. In the very first story, to introduce the entire book, Tuppence is a little, let's say, dissatisfied. Tuppence sighed and closed her eyes dreamily. So Tommy and Tuppence were married, she chanted, and lived happily ever afterwards. And 6 years later, they were still living together, happily ever afterwards. It is extraordinary, she said, how different everything always is from what you think it is going to be. A very profound statement, Tuppence, but not original. Eminent poets, and still more eminent divines, have said it before, and, if you will excuse me saying so, have said it better. 6 years ago, continued Tuppence, I would have sworn that with sufficient money to buy things with, and with you for a husband, life would have been one grand sweet song, as one of the poets you seem to know so much about puts it. Is it me or the money that palls upon you? Inquired Tommy coldly. Palls isn't exactly the word, said Tuppence kindly. I'm used to my blessings, that's all, just as one never thinks what a boon it is to be able to breathe through one's nose until one has a cold in the head. I just love it so much. They're not arguing. They're being delightful together. And, she's very forthright about being aware of what she has, but at the same time, you're like, we had adventures and now we don't. And maybe that would be nice. And so it goes on, and they do have adventures. And Christie sort of mimics some of the style of some of these authors, but also parodies them a little bit. And it's gentle. It's like not Saturday Night Live type style parodying. It's more like Galaxy Quest. It's a tongue-in-cheek homage, and I just love it so much. And of course, in the culmination of the book, she decides to lampoon herself. Tommy seated himself at the desk and addressed Tuppence. Mon ami, he said, we are here faced with a matter of the utmost gravity. You recall, do you not, the man who was number 4, him who I crushed like an eggshell? But he was not really dead. Ah, no, they never are. You comprehend, my friend? Perfectly, said Tuppence. You are the great Hercule Poirot. Exactly. No mustaches, but lots of little gray cells. I have a feeling, said Tuppence, that this particular adventure will be called The Triumph of Hastings. Never, said Tommy. It isn't done. Once the idiot friend, always the idiot friend. You know what's odd? I remember that line as Tuppence saying it to Tommy. But that's not the case. Quite often she's the one who gets in the zingers. But not in this instance. So, equal opportunity zingering. Another one that Steve Shives and I are currently reading through, me, again, him for the first time, is this one. And the current version is published under the much better title, And Then There Were None. A number of Christie's books are published under different titles in the UK and in the US. And that's another one, Lord Edgware Dies. It's kind of a dull title. I much prefer 13 at Dinner. And on the other hand, though, the 13 Problems, I prefer the UK title of, or maybe it's the US title. I get them confused. I prefer the title of the Tuesday Club, the Tuesday Night Club, the Tuesday Murders Club, something like that. But I like the idea of we'll get together on Tuesdays, it's the Tuesday Club, and we're going to talk about murder. It connects more with what the overarching story is. So this is one we're reading through, and it's legendary for how it plays out. And of course, we're working up to discussing Glass Onion, which for, being alone on the island, and people start to die, there's definitely some connections there, as well as Rian Johnson's obvious inspiration from Agatha Christie as well. So if you haven't read anything by Agatha Christie and or you're interested in getting started, I would strongly recommend starting with story collections. As I mentioned in my previous book talk, Under My Hat, I really like story collections. You know you're not going to get something, or it's very rare to get a collection where you like all of them. But that's the wonderful thing. If you don't like one story, you can just turn some pages, go to the next one. And so the story collections can give you a really good idea of which style or which type of characters you like best. Some of her story collections don't feature any of her well-known detectives. Some of them tend to be more adventure-y. Some of them tend to be more about melodrama. She also wrote a lot about sort of almost tending into magical realism, kind of before magical realism was really a thing. So my top pick for which collection you should start with would be Three Blind Mice and Other Stories. And here's why. She's best known for her detective fiction, and most of these are detective stories. They also feature stories with Poirot, Miss Marple, and one of her lesser-known detectives, and I'm using that term a little loosely, Mr. Satterthwaite. And that leads nicely into some of the supernaturally feeling stories, because Mr. Satterthwaite's stories also feature Mr. Quinn, and there's a collection called The Mysterious Mr. Quinn, which is about Mr. Quinn and Mr. Satterthwaite. But that's just them, so you don't get the breadth that you do in this one. A short story collection that doesn't feature all of her detectives, I think Poirot is the only regularly occurring character who's used there, is Witness for the Prosecution and Other Stories. And I like that because she does more playing about with not structure so much as sort of fiddling with your expectations, the way she did in some of her most legendary novels. Two of my favorites from that, of course, Witness for the Prosecution. You got a great Orson Welles ending, pre-Orson Welles, and the story Accident. Absolutely delightful building up towards the end. So good. And she's also really good at the last line. And the last line on that one, absolutely just not gutting, thrilling. Thrilling is a great way to put it. It just, sends a tingle up your spine. And then, of course, her blend of mystery and humor in The Mystery of the Spanish Shawl. The crime is not exactly solved, and but the resolution is just, it's delightful. It's fun. It's tongue-in-cheek. It leaves you just feeling good overall. I really like it. One of my favorite of her adventure stories is The Man in the Brown Suit, which I tend to get mixed up with The Secret Adversary because they refer to the adversary as Mr. Brown. So I'm always looking for this one, and I think I've got it, and then I'm like, Tommy and Tuppence aren't even in this one. And then I read this book and I love it. Her pulp novels are not as out there as like Edgar Rice Burroughs or some other, classic adventure style pulp novels. And they're certainly not as dark as the noir stuff. But there's a sense of thrill, of excitement, of adventure, and just of fun. And it's just, I don't want to say old fashioned, but it's just good natured, slightly silly fun. Not even silly in the sense of humorous, but in the sense of you don't have to take it too seriously. And it's just, it's a nice breather from how reality can sometimes be. And that sort of brings me right back around to Tommy and Tuppence again. Tommy and Tuppence are also the main characters in the very last novel she wrote, which is Postern of Fate. And it's not well written. And it is called her most forgettable novel. But I think there's something in the fact that she returns to them, that they do age, not quite chronologically, because she had a really long career. But I think it tells us something that she returned to these two adventuresome, young at heart people at the end of her career, struggling to write effectively. There's, critics have noted a lot of repetition, reduced vocabulary, structural weaknesses. Two people who love each other a lot, who have adventures together, who respect each other. And I think there's something to that. This is what matters. She definitely pushed back against Poirot sometimes. Didn't always seem to like writing about him. And he is very derivative, although very distinct from Sherlock Holmes. I think there was pretty clearly some resentment there, but she seems to have a fondness for Tommy and Tuppence, and I mean I can totally understand why. They're fun to write, and they're comfortable, and so I have a lot of warmth for Postern of Fate, even though I don't really like the story, and even Tommy and Tuppence are not as enjoyable there. What I like about it is the way it gets us to look at somebody who's not at their peak anymore, who's not doing a good job. And it reminds us that that's okay. You don't, even if you have been great, you don't always have to be great. That it's sometimes okay to color within the lines and not do something novel or unexpected or brilliant. Sometimes good enough is still good. Still enough. And as a teacher and somebody who cares a lot about my work and who really pushes to do good, it's nice to have that reminder. So if you're curious about Agatha Christie, again, I would strongly recommend trying out Three Blind Mice or Double Sin and Other Stories, or some of the other short story collections. If you have a favorite Christie novel or a Christie short story, tell me in a comment. I love those. And if you have other recommendations for other authors whose style or characterization or dialogue especially reminds you of Agatha Christie, please make a recommendation to me. I'd love to hear from you. Bye for now.